Hello, everyone. We will wait a couple more minutes for more participants to join, and then we will start. All right, so now we'll start with the introduction of the Summer Academy. So this event tonight is part of the Summer Academy for Pluralist Economics. It's an event that's a summer school for people from all around the world. It started this Friday and will continue until the coming Friday. So it started last Friday and will continue until this Friday. And we have 10 workshops with topics about heterodox economics. And I know that some of you in the audience are here from the summer school, but we also welcome everyone from the wider public who has decided to join us tonight for this panel discussion on climate pricing, with the topic of whether carbon pricing is the ultimate solution. Now I will play a short teaser that we have prepared about the Summer Academy. Sorry. Right. So here you can see our panelists for tonight. Unfortunately, Mariana can't join tonight because she has fallen ill. But we're still happy to have these three amazing panelists with us tonight. We're very much looking forward to the discussion tonight. I will now de-share my screen so you can also see the panelists, and I will say a couple of words about who they are, their academic background and research interests. So first we have Sanjay Patnaik, who is the director of the Center on Regulation and Markets, the Bernard L. Schwartz Chair in Economic Policy Development, and a fellow in Economic Studies at Brookings. So he's also a fellow for the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy at Johns Hopkins University. And his research focuses on climate policies, specifically on carbon pricing, business and government relations, and globalization and international business. We also have Samantha Ashman joining us as a panelist tonight. She's an associate professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg. And she's currently acting as the director of the new university's MPhil program in industrial policy, which is run jointly with the UN IDUP in Senegal. And her fields of research are post-apartheid economic development in South Africa, financialization, industrial development, and industrial policy. And finally, we are joined by Fausto Corvino, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in moral philosophy in the Der Polis Institute for Law, Politics and Development and at Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies. There he is working on a project on the ethical and social challenges of climate change. And his main research interests lie in the theories of justice, including global and intergenerational justice, the philosophy of economics, and applied ethics, particularly the ethics of climate change. So as you can see, we're very well represented here. Right, so now we'll go over the word to Sanjay to also introduce himself very quickly and give his opening input to tonight's panel.
Well, thank you so much, Sophie, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak here today about such an important topic. As Sophie already mentioned, I'm currently the director of the Center on Regulation and Markets at the Brookings Institution, which is one of the oldest and most established think tanks in the United States. And we are housed within the Economic Studies program, which you can think of a little bit as the economics department of Brookings. Just a little bit about myself. So originally, I grew up in Austria. I did my undergrad and my master's in Austria with a focus on economics and environmental economics, as well as some energy aspects of finance. Afterwards, I worked for a little bit at JP Morgan in Germany before starting my doctorate at Harvard University in the United States, in Boston, where I spent my PhD there for 5 years. The doctorate was in strategy, and my focus in the research was on carbon markets and carbon pricing, and how firms actually react to cap and trade programs and carbon pricing. After that, I spent several years as a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania and the George Washington University. And now I moved to Brookings 2 years ago to develop the center. And so one of the big parts of our center is climate and climate risk management, and of course, carbon pricing. My own work and my own research has focused on carbon pricing now for almost 15 years, I would say, including my work as a student. And so carbon pricing as an economist is obviously, or would be obviously, the ideal way to reduce emissions. There is a broad consensus across the economics profession that if you want to force people to transition to a low carbon economy, you have to put a price on carbon emissions so that it becomes more expensive for people to do so. And we have seen that, especially after the Paris Agreement in 2015, there are a lot of jurisdictions around the world that are implementing carbon pricing, both at the subnational level and at the national level. And also, if we look at the EU at the international level, and my own research is focused very heavily on carbon markets in the EU and on the European Union cap and trade program or emissions trading scheme. And so what we see now, and anyone who's interested, you can go to the World Bank's carbon pricing dashboard. They have a really good overview of what kind of programs we have out there. We now have about 75 programs that are implemented or being implemented on carbon pricing. And so it's really taken off around the world. And we see that governments are serious about putting a price on carbon. And more companies are actually also implementing a carbon price internally within their own operations to be able to reduce the carbon footprint. The notable exception is where I'm based now, the United States. We do not have a carbon price at the federal level because of the political situation. It's been impossible to pass it. The only carbon price we have here is on a regional level in California, which has its own cap and trade program, and a few states on the East Coast only for the power sector. And as you might have heard, last week, the Democrats unveiled a package that is aimed at mitigating climate change, but that package does not include carbon pricing. It is basically, as I like to say, only carrots, no stick, because carbon pricing is like the stick approach. So they try to induce a transition to a low carbon economy, mainly through subsidies, through financial support for private households, for companies, to facilitate the transition. It's kind of like a reflection of the political realities here. And at least I think it's, if it passes, it would be the biggest legislation focused on climate ever passed in the United States. I'm happy to talk about the details of carbon pricing. Just one kind of like quick takeaway, why I think that carbon pricing is the most efficient way, because it addresses the negative externality of greenhouse gas emissions. It forces anyone who emits carbon to actually face the true costs of doing so. With this, I'll hand it over to my colleagues, and then we can go through the questions that Sophie has prepared for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. That was a really interesting introduction, both of you and your work, as well as a first look into what we're going to talk about. So now I want to give the introductory input over to Samantha.
Okay, hi, hope everyone's well out there. Thank you ever so much for the introduction. It's really great to be part of this. I'm British, as you can probably tell. So I was brought up and educated in Britain, did my PhD in Britain, but I moved to South Africa in 2009. Firstly, I was at the University of the Witwatersrand, and then I moved over to the University of Johannesburg, where we have a program on industrial policy, and we run it as a partnership with the Economic Commission on Africa. So we get students from across Africa. And the aim of the program is to build up understanding and knowledge of industrial development and industrial policy, and how African economies might break out of dependence upon unprocessed commodity exports, and the challenges and the opportunities. So addressing the climate issue is absolutely central for us, and it's really tempting for students, I see it with students, to see it as a sort of luxury, as maybe, oh, you know, maybe we can think about that in 20 years or 30 years when we've had a bit of structural change and we've got stronger economies, you know, in an ideal world. And, you know, I really try and the program, we really try and emphasize how that's just really not the way to look at it. We don't have that kind of amount of time. So there's, I mean, we have lots of issues there which we could talk about. But in terms of, I mean, my approach to economics, in Britain, I was involved, a supporter of reteaching economics, and here in Johannesburg we have something called Rethinking Economics for Africa, which is sort of based on reteaching to try and address what are, you know, huge curriculum issues in the teaching of economics in South Africa. Really demonstrated by what to me are inadequate mainstream perspectives. Again, much more to discuss there. Let me get to the topic in hand. So I've written down 6 really big points. Right, they're really brief. I'm going to make something really brief, but 6 really big points. So firstly, I wouldn't argue against carbon pricing, but I certainly wouldn't argue that it's the ultimate solution, as in the question posed for us. I mean, I think there's a problem in looking at climate change as a question of market failure and not system failure. So that's my kind of basic gambit. So that's number 1. I think we need really sort of radical and economy-wide change, and we need rapid and economy-wide change, and that's the time issue is important. So point 2 then is about urgency, and let me say, well, I'm in sub-Saharan Africa, so sub-Saharan Africa is warming at twice the global mean. This is what the data shows very clearly. So, you know, when we talk about the world possibly exceeding 1.5, you know, it's very likely, unfortunately. So possibly going to exceed 1.5 in warming. That's 3 degrees here. I mean, and that's already devastating. I mean, if we get higher than 1.5, we start looking at 2 degrees, we're talking about life not being sustainable. You know, cattle can't live at the sorts of temperatures which are clearly possible according to the IPCC. So urgency is really important. 3, we do need a transition, and I think there will be a transition, and I think carbon pricing's got a role to play in it, but we also need to emphasize how we have a just transition. That seems to me a really central issue. And when we're talking about a perspective from the global south, where we're talking about histories of colonialism, and perhaps even colonial present-day realities. Some would suggest that's even more important, and that for economists we need to take history seriously. That's one of the, I think, really central parts of the critique of the mainstream, is that history matters. And so I think in terms of justice, I'm interested in what Fausto has to say, but I certainly agree with the sort of approaches which say that climate change we need to think about distributive, procedural and restorative dimensions to ensuring a just transition. I would say in relation to South Africa, these are my last 2 points. I think it's extremely important, if we look at the bigger picture of what we're addressing, then I think you can see clearly that racial, gender, class, and environmental injustice are very closely interwoven. And we need, if we're talking about what are the tools that we need to identify the problem, and we need to think about how do we address those issues. I think at the same time as addressing the climate crisis. Better economists for a better future is your theme. And that my final point in this opening is, I think we always say in these discussions that this is an opportunity, that the question of the transition and making it a just transition and addressing inequalities and divisions is that's there. That's a real possibility. That's a possibility, and I think that's right. But I also think I would have to say, from the perspective of South Africa, it's also very possible that a transition will come that will be very rapid and very harsh. We're talking about this specific. Look at South Africa is a very coal-dominated economy. It's been very slow to have the discussion, but the discussion is now gathering speed, and there is a very good, I think, strong possibility that the Mpumalanga, the province which is very dominated by coal power stations, by coal production, there's very little extra employment opportunity, and Mpumalanga will be dumped in the transition. So that's a real worry that needs to be addressed rapidly and far-reachingly.
Thank you very much, Samantha, for this very urgent intro to our talk. You've touched on the importance of just transition, and also about how the climate crisis is made up of very interwoven injustices. And I think being conscious of that is exactly also why we invited Fausto with his expertise to this talk. So now I will give the word over to Fausto to introduce himself and what he is researching on.
So thank you very much for inviting me. And as you said, I will mainly speak from the perspective of a philosopher, a moral philosopher, because this is my job. I'm postdoc in philosophy at Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies here in Italy. But I'm a philosopher who deals with climate change, with transition policies, and also with carbon pricing in general. As we know, there are three different climate mitigation policies. There is regulation, both performance standard and technology standard. There are green energy subsidies, and there is carbon pricing. My personal position, which is shared by many, is that carbon pricing obviously is not a perfect climate policy. It is ethically problematic, and we can discuss it later if you want. There are problems about nature commodification. There are problems with carbon border adjustment mechanisms, penalizing like developing countries, which are the victims of climate change and so on. But I think, at least this is my personal position, that carbon pricing is the best of the available option if we take into account the need to achieve climate neutrality by the middle of this century. And in my view, the effort that we should make is threefold, basically. And first, to design carbon pricing reform as fairly and socially acceptable as possible. And I'm not simply referring to the carbon pricing itself, but also to the distribution of the revenues, which is the key issue for the social acceptability, for the justice-related aspect of carbon pricing. Then the second challenge is to address the double problem of carbon leakage and also carbon inequality that carbon pricing risks exacerbating. And the third challenge is to communicate carbon pricing in an effective way. If I have to summarize why many experts, not only me, because I'm not an expert, not an economist, but why many people think that the carbon pricing reform is the best of the available option is because, first of all, it produces both static and dynamic mitigation incentives. It produces static mitigation incentive because it leads people to emit less CO2, basically, as Sanjay said before, because if you ask people to internalize the social cost of carbon, they will emit less. But it also produces dynamic mitigation incentive because it pushes industries to invest in new technology that can reduce emissions in the future. And regulation and subsidies can produce static mitigation incentive, but these incentives are limited because, for example, if you have a performance standard, consumers will be incentivized to meet the standard, but not to outperform the standard. And also regulation does not produce dynamic incentive because actually it can also be the case that some companies do not want to invest in technology that can reduce emission further in the future because this technology can become the new standard. Then the other advantage is that carbon pricing allows to achieve climate mitigation at the lowest cost to society because different individuals have different mitigation costs, and regulation does not distinguish between people. So it is cost effective if you want. The third, I concluded, but the third advantage is that carbon pricing prevents the so-called rebound effect, because it tends to be the case that investment in energy efficiency produce a reduction in greenhouse gases emission that are proportionally smaller than the reduction in energy consumption per unit induced by the improvement in energy efficiency. And last but not least, carbon pricing yields tax revenues. So-called carbon revenues. And this implies two things. The first thing is that carbon pricing does not burden public finances, but rather brings in new resources. And the second thing is that given that these resources are controlled by the government, they can be managed democratically, but also progressively and to the benefit of a large segment of the population. On the contrast, regulation reduces the supply of fossil fuel and so increases their price. So it's the same effect of a tax, but the money that consumers pay ends up in the pockets of the energy companies, not in the public budget. So this is my claim.
Thank you very much. So now that we've hooked all our participants in with your amazing introductions, I want to go through a couple of housekeeping points, which relate to, first of all, that this webinar is recorded. But just to let you know, you won't be visible as a participant because we are using the webinar function on Zoom, where we can only see and record panelists. So we have also disabled the chat feature, but we do have a great Q&A feature, which you can use on the bottom of your screen. So tonight, different to the lectures we've had before in the Summer Academy, we will bring the audience and the audience questions into the discussion throughout the event. So my lovely colleagues who are sitting next to me, they are monitoring the chat and will alert me to questions that are relevant to the discussion that is going on right now, and then we will bring you into the discussion. Then there's another thing. There are two options to ask a question. You can tick a box in the Q&A section that lets you ask questions anonymously. If you ask anonymously, in that case, I will simply read your questions to the panelists and they will answer your question. However, if you post your question with your name, so if you do not tick the anonymous box, then we will give you the chance to unmute yourself and you can ask the question directly to the panelists. In that case, just be aware that your voice will be in the recording that we will upload to the internet. Then what we also would like to ask you, since this is a panel tonight and not just a single lecturer, if you have a question and you want a specific panelist to answer your question, please say so in your question, especially if you use the anonymous function, because then you can't, well, you only have a question to get your point across because we will read it out for you. Yes, that is all. And we will now move on to the exciting part, which is the discussion. Right. So we've mostly heard already the different perspective on what the economic rationale behind carbon pricing is. I will still pose the question once more. Well, I haven't posted yet, but it has been answered very much in the introductions. But if one of you wants to give a very, very quick answer, what is the rationale, the most important rationale to have carbon pricing? And I would also very interesting. Maybe ask Samantha also to give her take on why there is an economic rationale, even if you do not view carbon pricing as the best solution. Right, we'll start again with Sanjay, and then you just raise your hand as we said before, if you want to go on.
Great, thank you. So a very short why carbon pricing, and it's going back to what I said earlier, and building on what Fausto said. When we have a negative externality, right? In economics, we talk about a market failures or negative externality, which is something that is not priced in the market. To give you a very basic example, let's say you have a chemicals factory on upstream in a river, and you have a fishery downstream, and the chemicals factory releases the toxic waste into the water, and it doesn't pay for it, just for free. Just puts it in there, so it has lower production costs, but the toxic waste downstream kills off all the fish, so the fish is not productive, the fishery. And so this is clearly a market failure, because the upstream factory does not account for the costs of its true production, which is basically also including the waste. And so in environmental economics and environmental regulation, what we do is we make sure that they have to pay a price for this, so that they cannot either release it into the river, or they have to dispose of it in a much better way, or they have to pay a much higher price for doing so, in order to disincentivize them from actually releasing the waste for free into the water. And the same is for climate change, right? We currently, in many areas, we don't pay for emitting CO2 and carbon dioxide, but someone else is paying the price. As Samantha said, there are already a lot of areas in the world that are really paying a very hefty price, because climate change has started, because of droughts, extreme weather events, higher temperatures. And so in order to internalize these costs, to make everyone who emits carbon dioxide actually truly bear the cost of climate change, we have to put a price on the carbon emissions, basically saying that if you emit CO2 because you drive your car somewhere, or you heat, or you produce something in a factory, you will have to pay for that, so that you actually see what the true cost is of what you're doing, and then you will find ways to reduce that cost. So it incentivizes companies, consumers, to actually find ways and find ways to reduce their carbon footprint, and maybe make investments in low carbon technologies. And to give you a good example, which is not carbon pricing, but just to showcase that effect, is when we look at the current crisis with Ukraine, right? Because of the Ukraine crisis, gas prices and energy prices have shot up around the world, including the United States. And it has already prompted behavior changes among consumers, where they say, I'm looking for electric vehicles, I'm looking for cars that are not as big and not using as much gasoline. And so that's the incentive here, right? People care about money. And usually that's one of the biggest things that people care about. And many times climate change can be abstract for those that are not directly affected by it. But if you put a price on it, and you show it's an economic issue, and it's an issue of risk management, that allows people to think and choose among low carbon technologies and make choices that are better for the climate.
Right. Thank you. Do any of the other panelists want to add something from that? Otherwise, I think we have a very interesting question in the chat that I would pose to Sanjay. No? Okay.
Sure, let me see. Yeah.
Yes. Then the question from the chat is carbon pricing truly in itself the best solution, or is it the only solution in Marx so far that it fits the logic of governments and international organization, and hence the system?
So that's a very interesting question, I have to say. Building on Fausto, I mean, as an economist and looking at how our economic system works, right? Our economic system is completely built on the market economy, on price signals. And in our current economic system, I believe that carbon pricing is, as Fausto correctly said, the most cost-effective and the most efficient solution to get there. There are many other ways. There are regulations, there are subsidies. But then again, as Fausto pointed out, for subsidies, you have to put public money into companies. You have to put public money into these subsidies, which that money has to come from somewhere, right? And regulation oftentimes is not as cost-effective, because it treats a lot of entities, a lot of factories or companies the same way. So I would answer, based on your question, that given the economic system that we do have, that works on price signals and works on steering demand and consumer choices based on price, it's the most efficient and cost-effective.
Right. I think I will pose the question to Samantha. Since you talked about it's that in essence the crisis of climate is not a market failure so much as it is a system failure. I think this fits quite well with the question that was posed in the chat, in the sense that maybe carbon pricing is just a solution if you only look at the system as it exists now and don't think about the possibility of a systemic change. Maybe you can go into that a bit more.
Yeah, am I unmuted? I think I'm unmuted. So, I mean, well, there's a couple of things I'd like to say. You know, I mean, I do see a role for this. I mean, it's very interesting. The EU has measures. It's got measures which plan to be implemented against high carbon intensive exporting countries. So in South Africa, the debate has really shifted in the last couple of years, partly because people are realizing that this is a reality. Producers are really realizing this is a reality, and they're going to have to do something, or they're going to lose their export markets. And you know, there's a very big historical link between South Africa and European markets, so it's a big export destination. So, you know, and that's in a way, I mean, it's perhaps been a bit more of an impact than might have been predicted. So, I'm not suggesting that there's no role for those sorts of measures. However, I suppose the discussion raises the question: can the market solve the problem that the market created in the first place? I suppose we might put it like that. And what's the role for the state, and what's the role for public money? And you know, certainly, let me just talk about South Africa. It's the economy, the best. You know, I see without a role for the state and without the role for a massive level of public investment, I see the future actually quite bleakly, because you're talking about a society which has mass unemployment. You know, and whichever way you slice or dice the data, you're talking about really at least 50% unemployment. Youth unemployment is much higher. Rural area unemployment is much higher. African women unemployment is much higher. You're not talking about a society where there's big informal a big informal economy or a small-scale agriculture, because that was deliberately destroyed by the apartheid regime, which was a white minority regime, which didn't want competition from African producers, wanted a stable supply of cheap labor. I mean, the whole economy is constructed around a very sort of energy-intensive core, and a very racialized labor force, and characterized today by a very racialized inequality. So if people know anything about South Africa, what they generally know is that of the countries which keep data, it's the most unequal country in the world, and that is, like I say, it's a highly racialized pattern of inequality. So, you know, even imagine a world without climate change. South Africa needs a real radical economic transformation to create sustainable livelihoods. So I think we need to move beyond saying we simply need, we need something that's much bigger than price signals and price mechanisms. So we have an economy. It works quite well for 10% of the population, and one way to go, of course, is simply to build higher security walls and higher fences and have more efficient private against rising crime and so forth. But we have, if you like, people talk about a dystopian future. South Africa has a dystopian present. And I think that we need, therefore, so we need to talk about, okay, I think climate jobs. How do we create employment in addressing the climate crisis, and therefore create more meaningful livelihoods and grow domestic demand, and address the climate crisis at the same time? So I need convincing that market mechanisms can do that.
Right. Thank you also for the insight in on the South African economy and the inequalities that are very high over there. I would now take Fausto to have a word, and Sanjay after that, because Fausto has spoken less so far. I'm very curious to hear what you say, Fausto, as you, of course, are very critical from your philosophical perspective on carbon pricing, but you did say it is the best of available options. So now I will pose this question to you about the, whether we can operate within this same system, or if there should be a systemic change in order to tackle the climate crisis.
Thank you very much. No, I wanted to say something about state intervention, because I agree with Samantha that we need state intervention, obviously, and not simply at the domestic level, but also at the global level. Because the risk, for example, is that I also saw another question in the chat about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but I mean the two issues are linked in my view, because if a country, for example, introduces a carbon tax, and then also introduces a carbon border adjustment mechanism, that is to say, taxes all the imports coming from other countries that have a lower carbon price or no carbon price, then the question to ask is, what is this country going to do with the revenues? Because if this country then channels all the revenues within its own budget, then it's actually taxing other countries that maybe are not responsible for climate change and is using this money for its own purposes. And actually, I should say that it's a shame that basically this is what the European Parliament recently voted for in its vote about the carbon border adjustment mechanism that will be introduced. As you know, it's a proposal by the European Commission to be introduced in Europe. But actually, what the European Parliament says is that the carbon revenues that will be raised out of the carbon border adjustment mechanism will be channeled through the European budget. And then some other European representatives say, okay, no, but then we should also actually raise our climate finance funds. And so actually they try to seek a compromise. But basically what the European Union will do, they will tax exporters and then will channel the money to European citizens. And this is unfair. So also in this case, we need obviously state intervention, but I think that the state intervention should be at the point of revenue redistribution, also at the global level.
Thank you. Now over to Sanjay. You raised your hand before.
Great, thank you. A lot of interesting points. I want to kind of like respond to a couple of items. So on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, I actually think it's a good thing that the Europeans are doing this for a very simple reason. It's so far, the Europeans have been the only ones, or if we go back to 2005, that had a significant price on carbon in their territory. And we saw a lot of the international negotiations that people committed to it. And Paris, I think, was a step forward. And as I mentioned earlier, after Paris, a lot of countries and regions have started implementing carbon pricing. But I think a carbon border tax in Europe will really incentivize other countries to transition to a carbon pricing scheme much more quickly. And when talking about state intervention versus market, it's really important to keep in mind that the carbon price is already significant state intervention, right? It is a public policy choice. A carbon price does not come naturally from the market. The government imposes a carbon price either through a carbon tax or through a cap and trade program, and then can decide what to do with the revenues. So if we have a domestic carbon price, it can definitely be effective by itself, going back to one of the questions in the chat. But the carbon border tax will provide additional incentives for other countries to follow the same path and not kind of like undercut domestic producers, right? Because if, let's say the EU has a carbon tax that makes production more expensive in Europe, which is the purpose. But then if cheaper imports come in from countries that don't have a carbon tax, that would be unfair towards European producers. And we have seen that in developed countries where like the United States or Australia, that don't have a federal carbon tax. I do agree with Fausto. It is very important to have exceptions for least developed countries and for countries that historically have not had the responsibility for climate change. Because when we think about it and we look at statistics, 70% of the responsibility or 70% of the emissions in the atmosphere that we have, the greenhouse gas emissions, can be traced back to Europe and the United States. So there is a clear historic legacy here that has to be accounted for. On the systemic change, going back to Samantha's perspective, I think we have to separate between two items here. One is the pure economics, right, which is carbon price is the most efficient, most effective in theory. The second part is the political economy and the politics. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is that climate change, oftentimes, even small changes are very hard to implement. We've seen that in France with the Yellow Vest protests after they tried to implement a carbon tax. We have seen that in the United States that has not been able to pass a federal climate legislation for 20 years and not even thinking about a carbon price. And even smaller incremental changes like a carbon price or like doing more on climate take a very big political lift. And so I think when we talk about systemic change, that is even a much bigger conversation that will not happen rapidly and that will be even more difficult to implement. Given the political realities in most countries where we don't have everyone agreeing on the same path forward, right? And so we have to be pragmatic, I think, when we look at climate. The climate debate is oftentimes very nuanced, which I think is unfortunately many times lost in the debate. It's often driven very strongly by ideologies on both sides, but it's nuanced. And climate needs a pragmatic approach because on the one hand, we have to reduce emissions and we have to prepare people to adapt to a changing climate. On the other hand, people, especially in developing countries, they want to develop. They want to get the same level of lifestyle that we have in the West, and we cannot deprive them of it, and it would be unfair to do so. And so we have to find a balance. Like when we look at the options, it's a big menu of options. I think carbon pricing should play a major role, but there are other options as well that have to go into this, obviously, so that we can look at multiple aspects of it, including the justice aspects, the equity aspects, and the aspects that we have political realities where we have to find ways to advance these policies. And carbon pricing, at least luckily in Europe, has been at least uncontroversial most of the times. In other countries, it has not been. And so we have to find ways forward for that, I think.
Right. If there's no immediate reactions from you, I would pose another question from the chat, which is about how a carbon tax might affect the development of clean energy technologies, if that can be helpful for creating those technologies and, as Samantha mentioned, create climate jobs.
I can answer quickly first. So I think carbon pricing can work in multiple ways for that. One is, and that's the intended effect, if it makes fossil fuels more expensive, which it's supposed to, if the price is high enough, companies will start investing in research and development in trying to find ways to reduce the carbon footprint. So that's one clear mechanism, right? If you start paying, I don't know, $50, $60, which is a pretty high carbon price per ton of CO2, as a manager, as a company, will start thinking about investing in alternatives and finding ways to reduce your emissions. That's one way. And the second way is where you can use, as from the government perspective, the revenues from carbon pricing to help some of those technologies develop. And so I think that definitely there's a big role to play for that. We often forget that a lot of major technological advancements, and that includes fossil fuels and includes nuclear, had a lot of government support at the beginning. Oftentimes we forget that, but nuclear would not have been possible without government support. The same for fossil fuels in the beginning. And so we have seen that with solar and wind, where initially some of the subsidies that Europe provided catalyzed that industry significantly. And so there is another way where we can use some of the revenue from carbon pricing to provide initial grants, initial funding for really risky ideas that maybe the market would not want to invest in. And so I think there's a dual role that can be played here by carbon pricing.
Okay, Fausto or Samantha, whoever of you.
Samantha.
Okay. Hey, the picture's complex here. You know, from the situation I'm in, remember, I'm in a situation where we've got an economy that's still where power is still very much coal dominated, to 80% of electricity is coal generated, and wind and solar are increasing as a proportion of the grid, and there's huge potential here. We're in southern Africa. There's a lot of wind. There's a lot of sun. You know, there's there's a great potential here, but there's lack of manufacturing capacity. So obviously, one way forward is that there will be a huge importing of technology. So, you know, getting that balance right is an important question. I'm not sure. I don't think carbon pricing is really going to help here, but thinking of ways of generating local content production for wind and solar seems to me it's absolutely central question, that an urgent question. That requires a lot of finance, and that you know, if carbon pricing can release some development finance to us, then that's good. But development finance is absolutely essential in making this broad transition and a more rapid transition. So wind and solar are the way to go. But I would also say that there's a powerful gas lobby, which is really trying to foist gas on many African economies, including on South Africa, because it's being presented as a transition fuel. Because now, look, it's a fossil fuel. It's not it's not what we need. But there are gas producers, because the fossil fuel industry is very large, it's very powerful, and in many ways it's still growing. There are producers, and there are also people in the state and in government who accept the argument that it's a useful transitional fuel. You know, these are really important questions, and very immediate questions, which show some of the dilemmas that we face.
Thank you, Samantha. Yeah, Fausto, now you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, I wanted to say something on green jobs, and obviously, I mean, I think, as Sanjay said, we should distinguish between the price and the revenues. It's clear to everyone that the carbon price in itself will foster investment in green technologies, probably more than other alternatives. But then, I think there could be some ethical problem probably with investing the revenues in green technologies. Why? Because if you invest it in green jobs, for example, you cannot take it for granted that actually the poorest in society can compete for these jobs. And probably if you invest in green jobs, then the net benefits will go to middle and higher classes in society, probably. So I think here there could be a trade-off between the effectiveness of the carbon tax in reducing emissions and equity. If you invest part of the revenues in green technologies and green jobs, probably you maximize the effectiveness of the carbon tax. Whereas if you give the revenues back to people as carbon dividends, equal per capita rebates, then probably you will have a progressive tax reform. And so you maximize equity. And that's a political choice. That's an art political choice. And there is also, I think, an epistemic problem here. Because if you are an energy consumer, for example, and the government presents you with a sort of positive revenue carbon tax reform, say, okay, just pay the carbon tax, then give me the money, and I will use this money wisely. You have no guarantee that actually the government will use the money wisely, and you cannot even judge your position. You can say, okay, but I'm going to be a net winner or a net loser of this carbon pricing reform. Instead, if you give the revenues back to people, forgetting about investing in green jobs, then from an epistemic point of view, you can evaluate your position. And you can say, okay, every month I will pay this sum of money in carbon tax, and every month I will receive this sum of money as carbon dividends. Is it something good for me, or is something bad for me? And these are elements that to be taken into account when we make a political choice about it, I think.
Right. If any of you want to react to this, I will give you the floor now, but we also have an audience question, which is about greening businesses, which I would then let the participant ask. Okay, then we have unmuted Manuel. Please ask your question.
Yeah, hello. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, very often what companies are asking for is they say we have to plan, we have to have security for greening our business model or whatever. We have to look forward a few years and see what we have to do. But actually isn't regulation, like for example, banning something, giving the absolute planning security, if you know fossil fuels are forbidden from 2030, let's say, that's absolute planning security. Whereas the carbon price can be changed politically, could be higher or lower compared to price level and so on. That was it.
Manuel, do you want to pose this question to someone specific or just the general question?
I would say mostly to Sanjay, but anyone who feels like.
Okay, then we start with Sanjay.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think you bring up a very good point, and I do believe that there's a role to play for both regulation and carbon pricing. And when we look at some of the countries that have successfully tackled their greenhouse gases better than others, they oftentimes use a mixed approach, right? They do carbon pricing, they probably do some regulation in some areas as well, and potentially even some subsidies. And so they use both the sticks and the carrots in multiple ways. Obviously, the carbon price can fluctuate, especially if it's a cap and trade program. In a cap and trade program, you can have fluctuations based on demand and supply, and those can be quite significant. We see that in Europe now, right? Maybe like 10 years ago, the price was about €5 per ton. Now it's above, I think, €75 per ton. When you have a carbon tax where the government sets the tax, I think you have a bit more security, because you can, at least if you codify it into law, you can kind of like put the trajectory of the carbon tax into law. There are ways around even for the cap and trade programs where you can have at least a price floor, which California has done, so that the price cannot go below a certain number. So that's kind of like an implicit carbon tax of at least a minimum tax, right? So I think the most important thing is to have a carbon price in place. That's really oftentimes what companies want, that investment security. They don't want kind of like that game, whether the guessing game, oh, do we get a carbon price or not? Will it be there next year or not? They want to know there will be a carbon price in the next 10 years and at least get some expectations of how the price will develop. And that will provide them already with much more certainty than we have seen, for instance, in the United States. But I do agree. I think regulation can be a good supplement to it. And to give an example, in the US, for instance, where we don't have a federal carbon price, a lot of measures have been done through regulation, and fuel standards for cars are one of those examples where you can provide kind of like the regulatory nudges and incentives for car manufacturers to do something about it, and you can plan it a bit longer. One problem with regulation in the United States, though, is that oftentimes regulation, or most of the times, it is done within the executive agencies in the US, like the Environmental Protection Agency. And so what has happened in the last 20 years is you have a Democratic administration. They do a lot of regulation on climate, and they put stringent regulations in place. And then you have a Republican administration, and they roll everything back. And so oftentimes that actually, I think, provides less certainty than if you have something codified into law that is a bit more long-term. The current bill that is debated in the Senate now, that the Democrats are advancing, would provide a lot of the financial incentives for up to 2030. So I think that at least would provide more certainty than we've seen in the past. So I think you can have certainty and uncertainty in both scenarios, both with regulation and carbon pricing, as a short answer. And oftentimes, if you combine the two, you can actually have more effective transitions.
Okay, so even though the question mostly addressed Sanjay, Samantha, you also want to answer?
Yeah, I'll chip in something. I suppose, I suppose what I'm thinking, let's have it as part of a global policy package, but we need to think about the other dimensions of the package more. And you know, I will keep going on about the need for the employment. How do we generate greater employment? And what are the measures that we can take that can generate employment? And you know, I'm sitting somewhere where that needs to be across all levels. You know, there's the big national, what we do about the national grid, what we do about the energy system, how we make a more rapid transition to clean energy technologies and green hydrogen. You know, in a mining economy. I mean, there's those big issues. There's what do we do? How do we encourage employment generating low carbon sectors? Because they've got to be really, really important to try and address the employment crisis. What do we do about one successful area of industrial policy in South Africa has been in cars. It's not car manufacture, it's really car assembly. There's a big incentive scheme for you know, largely European and American producers. What do we do about that? You know, that's a massive issue. It's got to make a transition to EVs, or else it's going to die. You know, and it may die quite quickly. So we need thought around that. We need a basic income grant as well for the people who in the short term who are actually have a crisis of livelihoods, a crisis of livelihoods which has intensified enormously because we have not only COVID, obviously COVID, lockdown, all those problems that we all saw, but you know, in the last 10 years, manufacturing has shrunk. We've got a deindustrializing economy. We've got an economy which is shrinking manufacturing, big mining, big finance, powerful finance, non-developmental finance. You can get a loan for anything. You can debt, up. That's the reality of the economy. So we need lots and lots of, we need really kind of wide-reaching and radical, to me, radical solutions to address all these different dimensions to the problem. I'm not saying that any of this is easy. I don't think any of this is easy, but it's like if we don't I'm feeling like if we don't recognise the scale of the problems that we face, we're not really going to come up with the sorts of thinking and just the efforts. I mean, it may all fail. The failure is unfortunately an option. And another issue which I think is really important where I sit, it's actually really important everywhere, and that's food. Because clearly there's massive issues around energy. They're very, very immediate issues, and pollution and so forth. But the land use, you know, it's getting hotter, it's getting drier. One possible way scenario going forward is a greater use of artificial AI, high-tech food production. Well, I mean, it's got advantages for water use. It's not good on employment generation. We've got a highly concentrated food system. You know, we have supermarkets who are as influential here as they are in Europe. There are issues around how do we get greater localization of food production? How do we restore land that's been destroyed in all sorts of ways? How do we have climate smart agriculture that doesn't simply benefit the very large producers who currently dominate the food chains? I mean, so I mean, let me throw all those out, but they're really very pressing, because one of the impacts of climate change has been multi-year droughts. We've already got multi-year droughts. You know, they're with us. They're going to get worse. So we've got this. There's a big contrast between the kind of concentrated land ownership and food production and the livelihoods of very many millions of people who are outside those systems. How do we bridge that gap? To me, that gap must be bridged by greater localization. How do we incentivize localization and so forth? But these are very much part of the climate discussion, I think.
Please, Fausto.
Thank you. No, on the, I wanted to say something about the question. It was about regulation and versus carbon pricing, and so it made me think that actually I wanted to say it before, but I didn't mention it. I think that carbon we should also say, I think that carbon pricing probably does not work with the super rich, and so in that case we need some sort of regulation. Because we should consider that the behavioral plasticity of the super rich, if by super rich we mean the global top 1% of the world population, they control 18 times the same wealth as the bottom 50% of the world population. And actually, given that the carbon price is supposed to be equal for all, actually they could easily absorb any sort of carbon price. There are different carbon prices, but given that it's supposed to be equal for all, they could easily absorb the carbon price. And that's a problem, not simply in terms of equality, but also in terms of climate mitigation, because the global top 1% is responsible for the 17% of global emissions. In that case, probably we need some form of regulation. There are many people who are saying this. If you're interested in this topic, there is this beautiful World Inequality report that is published by the Paris School of Economics, and it's this chapter by Lucas Chancel that is specifically on carbon inequality. You can find a lot of data on this, and also some insights about some policies about carbon inequality. Just wanted to mention this.
Yes, thank you, Fausto. And we've gone very deep into policy already now, with also touching on land use and food security, which are all connected, of course, to not only the problem of the climate crisis, but also the best policy solution to this. But we want to take a step back now, actually, to a more philosophical plane, and wanted to ask the question: are there any, and if yes, what more concerns are associated with putting a price tag on environmental degradation?
Maybe we should let Fausto go first.
I think this is very much a question for him as the philosopher amongst us.
Well, okay, yeah, I think that all the moral objections to carbon prices are based on the assumption that commodification of nature, and more specifically on natural resources, is morally wrong. And carbon pricing, we can say, commodifies nature because it puts a price on emission permits. And emission permits are nothing more than permits to appropriate sustainable emission allowances, that is to say, quotas of the global carbon budget. And I think there are two different sort of moral objection in the literature. It does not mean that I think that this kind of arguments are right, but just to say what these arguments are very briefly. One argument that is very radical, and it is the first kind of objection, is that commodification of nature is unjust because nature does not belong to human beings. There are some people that say that human beings are custodians of stewards of nature, and so they cannot sell it. But the problem with this kind of argument is that if we buy this argument, then we must be willing to argue that when people exchange a title of land, or when they pack a salad and offer it on a market counter, then they are doing something that is morally unjust. So this kind of argument is pretty radical, and I will put it aside. But there is another sort of objection to carbon pricing, and this second type of objection, moral objection, was that individual obviously can acquire property right to natural resources, and they can market natural resources, but there are some natural resources that cannot be commercialized. And the carbon budget is one of these resources. And obviously, this second sort of moral argument requires some specification. No? Why the commodification of the carbon budget is morally different from the commodification of other natural resources. And there are different arguments that are put forward in the literature, I can say. One argument, we can call it like stigma removal and corruption of public morals. There are some people, for example, Michael Sandel, that say, well, the carbon price will turn what should be a fine into a fee. In other words, the carbon price brings the public message that through the simple use of money, human beings can appropriate as much nature as they want, whereas regulation makes explicit limits that must not be exceeded. And removing the stigma that is associated with CO2 emission is not only problematic for philosopher called retributivist reason, that is to say, an individual performs a wrong action without taking on the moral responsibility that goes with it. But also some philosophers like Robert Gooding, for example, say also for a consequentialist reason, because if you put a price on emissions, you risk weakening or reducing the convictions of those who believe the nature should be protected and conserved, and you also prevent the development of an environmental ethos in those people who do not yet have one. So this is one of the arguments that some people put forward against commodification of the carbon budget. And the other sort of moral argument is that actually through a carbon price, you can get to an unequal distribution of emission permits in a situation of economic inequality. Because if carbon pricing, for example, is implemented to a cap and trade system in a context of economic inequality, the commodification of the carbon budget allows the social optimum to be achieved even through a highly inequitable distribution of the climate mitigation burden. Because, for example, you can imagine that you put a cap and then distribute also the emission permits, and then the rich people buy the biggest amount of emission permits from the poorest people. And if this happens within a market that functions perfectly without distortion information asymmetries, we can assume that the unequal distribution of emission permits is the one that minimizes the social cost of optimal climate change. So we must infer, for example, that the rich have very high marginal abatement cost and the poor have very low abatement cost. So the former find it rational to buy permits and the former to sell. But if this happens, you create a sort of carbon aristocracy. That is to say, some people that can keep on emitting CO2, the very rich, while all the other people have to give up on their CO2 emission. But then you obviously have to demonstrate that there is something wrong with having a carbon aristocracy, and that's another story. But basically, I think this is the picture, the general picture.
Thank you, Fausto, for giving us this philosophical intro into climate policy. Are there any reactions from Sanjay or Samantha to this, or is this too much on the philosophy economists?
Well, go ahead, Samantha. You go first.
I mean, I'll share some thoughts. You know, this is really interesting and important. I think this is a summer school where we are thinking about pluralism and economics, and I think there are important issues here around what are the processes which have constructed the modern world economy or global political economy. And, you know, to me, they're, you know, process of conquest, of dispossession, of land alienation. These are constituent parts of the world economy today, of global political economy. And there are huge amounts of injustice involved in these processes. And if we have an economics discipline which can't talk about these things or recognize the profoundly unequal and often racial and racist nature of these processes, we've got a profoundly flawed discipline. So, you know, in a way, just getting these things on the table is, to me, a very important thing. And, you know, I use with students, you know, the donut economics, and, you know, just whatever pedagogical devices you find useful. Really, I'm for incorporating them. But I mean, one strand of literature which is sort of applied to South Africa and comes out of South Africa is that of racial capitalism. It's also obviously very important in the United States around Black Lives Matter and so on. I think we should talk about these sorts of issues in economics. You know, with the legacy in South Africa of unjust processes which have profound environment consequences are evident. You know, when 13% of the land of the country is assigned to the black majority. Throughout the history of the liberation movement, there has been African concern for what that means for the degradation of the land itself, because, you know, it's impossible to not to degrade it. And so the construction of an economy to benefit a minority in a profoundly racialized way. You know, remember, this is apartheid, it's white minority rule, the black majority is banned from voting. You know, there's the most obscene legislation that you can imagine that's passed. And so much of your life is determined by your race, and so much of that is tied to supplying the labour to provide gold to the world system, because for 100 years South Africa is the dominant producer of gold, the gold that supports the gold standard, the bullions that sit in the basement of the Bank of England and the US Treasury to this day come from the Witwatersrand where I am now. And you know, we need those sorts of historical processes which incorporate social, racial and environmental injustice seem to me to be absolutely essential. We can't understand the world in which we live, which I live, without looking at those sorts of processes. And if we have an economics which is simply dominated by mainstream approaches, we don't talk about all those things that I just said. You can do an economics degree in South Africa today and it doesn't hardly get mentioned. And you know, you can sit with students from Mpumalanga, and you know, and I know for a fact we have a course in our first year of our degree program which discusses work as a balance. You know, you've got a choice, you make a choice between work and leisure at the individual level. In a society with 50-60% unemployment, this is nonsense, absolute nonsense. So when we talk about a decolonial agenda for rethinking economics, you know, it's got very, very sharp, there are very sharp issues here. So yes, we need to talk about carbon taxes, but we also talk about a lot more. I think in a way that's what I've been saying again and again and again today.
Thank you, Samantha. I have a question actually for Sanjay. Do you
Sure.
agree with Samantha that mainstream economics cannot sufficiently address the issues that Samantha has explained right now?
So I think, I mean, obviously there is always ways to improve a discipline. I think when we look at economics, and going back to the original question, right, if there are moral concerns in putting a price on the environmental degradation, the fact is that human beings have commodified nature for thousands of years now, right? Whenever someone cuts down a tree and sells the lumber or sells vegetables or something, that's a commodification of nature, right? What we have not done until recently, maybe only the last couple of decades, is to put a price on these negative externalities, right? And thinking about how can we incorporate those when we cut down a forest, and then we don't have that forest here anymore to our enjoyment. It destroys the ecosystem. And that is what environmental economics is about, right? To put a price on that. And the reason is that in an economic system where you get benefits, economic benefits, when you sell the tree, when you cut it, but there's currently no benefit, or at least in the past, there was no benefit in preserving it, you need to find a way to measure that. And I believe that environmental economics has come a very long way in giving us tools to do so, right? Through some of the new innovative approaches and trying to evaluate the value of forests, the value of, as I said, when you pollute, actually to put a price on that, because it puts a price on the flip side. Basically, if you destroy nature, if you pollute something, then you actually have to pay a price. And for many, many decades or even centuries, I would say, we did not have that side. We had only the revenue side. So I think there's obviously always room for improvement. And I agree with Samantha. I mean, everyone knows that the economics profession is unfortunately one of the least diverse in the world in terms of who goes into the economics profession. It's a big problem in the United States. It's getting a bit better, but I think it's still big gender imbalances, big imbalances in terms of ethnic makeup and what backgrounds people have. So I think there's a long way to go to improve. But I do think there are innovative approaches, and that actually trying to put a price on these on environmental destruction can help us show us the flip side of what happens when we cut it down. And so I think they're very, very good approaches, and we have to push those forward, I think, and we have to elevate those because then they can rely on the same theory, the same math, and the same mechanisms behind that we have been using for other areas and for the revenue side to actually really show us what happens when we destroy nature and what is the loss that we all suffer if we do so. And when you put it in monetary terms, that's how it's usually easier quantified, more easily measured, and then people can make decisions more easily based on that.
Thank you, Sanjay, for this powerful plea for market-based instruments. Fausto.
Or something very short that I forgot to say, because I agree with you, I agree with the other participants and everything. And I wanted to say that the one counter objection that can be made against those people who are concerned about nature commodification is that if we consider the carbon budget, that you say the emission that we can still allow compatibly with the mitigation target, or with the rational mitigation, with an acceptable mitigation target. I mean, if we are concerned about commodification of the carbon budget, we should look at what kind of a regime we have now. And the regime that we have in the absence of the carbon price is what I would call like a free bar system or a free access system. So actually the alternative would be between commodification and free access, actually. So you can also say that probably commodification is problematic, could be problematic, but still is better than free access. Even though actually it would be the money that you have that will give you the access to this kind of resources, and this can remain problematic. But maybe this system is even better than free access, than mere free access.
Thank you, Fausto. I think in the Q&A we have a question that fits quite well thematically, because it actually mentions an alternative to carbon pricing, which is not market-based. So the question asks, they cite a paper of Hewer and Fricker from 2022, and the question states that one can get to different evaluations of the policy of carbon pricing if one is posing different normative premises of well-being and politics. The optimality claim can only hold if one has an aggregative liberal understanding of politics, and if one conceptualizes well-being as the need for satisfaction, whereas all needs are seen as equal. And then she poses the question, would sustainable consumption corridors be a better alternative, especially because carbon pricing is stabilizing the fossil economy? So basically, whether such a non-market-based policy could solve the problem of the commodification of nature.
Could you explain a bit more what sustainable corridors are?
So,
consumption corridors, because I have not heard that concept before.
Yeah, basically a consumption corridor would be the space between the floor of minimum consumption standards and a ceiling of maximum consumption standards. So the corridor between that would be the sustainable consumption corridor, and it's kind of comparable to the donut of donut economics.
And is that at the individual level or at the societal level? These corridors?
I think on the societal level, but I have to honestly say that I did not pose this question myself, so I'm also not entirely certain. Yeah,
I shall venture a thought, because that sounds like it's a useful idea. Because because of the question of inequality and the need for redistribution, and it seems to me that this also relates to the issue of debates around growth and degrowth, and how we navigate that discussion. Because I think some of the good literature in degrowth argues that the question is, we've got to meet basic social needs, and in meeting basic social needs, that will entail some growth. I think that's a good perspective, but to simply look at areas of Africa that I know, areas of South Africa that I know, and to advocate in a sort of unreflective way degrowth seems to me a kind of a morally problematic position, because so many basic needs are not being met. and that they require growth. And I don't mean it in the conventional growth paradigm way, but we need massive levels of investment. We need more energy. We don't need less energy, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to think about growth and degrowth in complex ways, and in relation to meeting basic social needs, and that redistribution is very much part of this conversation. I think there are some people who need to consume less. I see millions of people who need to consume more.
Just to build on that, I mean, the question then is, who determines who can consume more or less, right? Then we're in a communist system where you have a central authority and I don't think anyone wants that, right? I think the problem is that whenever you have suggestions like that, people will immediately react very opposed to that, understandably, right? When you tell someone you have to stop consuming or consume less, or you have to change your lifestyle radically, that will lead to much less acceptance for any measures on climate. And we live in democracies, luckily, at least the ones that are here today on the panel. And in democracies, you have to channel what the preferences of the public are. And if you tell them, well, we have a limit on what you can consume, and we put a corridor or like consumption restrictions on it, that will not work. It will be politically suicide, I think, for any politician to suggest that. And I also, frankly, don't believe in that we have to say we have to give up all the lifestyle and all the technological advancements we have achieved until now in the last couple of thousand years to address climate change. I think what we have to do is we have to make sure we use the right policy tools to be able to maintain our advancements, but with a lower carbon footprint. And that will include many of the tools we talked about today. But I think it can be done. I'll give you a good example, right? A couple of decades ago, there was this big debate of whether we will have enough food for our population or not. And you had like two camps. One camp said, oh, our population growth will outgrow the food supply. People will all starve to death. The other group said we will have technological innovation that will keep up with that. And then we had the Green Revolution. We had the introduction of fertilizers in many parts of the world that actually increased yields significantly and allowed us to grow much more food. And we have enough food currently in the world to feed everyone, but we're just not distributing it well. And this is a different problem, right? This is a political and a policy problem. But I think there's a big role to play for innovation, for technology. And we always have to keep in mind, we want people to do something about the climate and to be behind that and support these measures. And that's also very important how we talk about it and what kind of measures we propose to get that political support.
Fausto, please answer.
Thank you. No, one concern about the corridor is I think the administrative feasibility of this corridor, because if we interpret the corridor as the space between the floor and the ceiling of emissions, then it means that we have a collective cap, collective ceiling, and then you have to translate this collective ceiling into individual quotas. And one issue is what kind of distributive principle do you use for translating the collective cap into individual quota, like emission egalitarianism, grandfathering? I don't know. It's difficult to do. But on a practical level, then how do you control that people are respecting their quota when they go around, when they travel, even when they breathe, if you want? So it would be kind of difficult, I think, even though it can make sense theoretically too. But I'm not sure. It's just a concern that they wanna raise. It would be really burdensome for any state. And also, if you try to think about it at the global level, how can you scale up this kind of approach to the global level and coordinate every country in the world and guarantee that all the entire humanity remains within this corridor?
Thank you. I think all your answers to this question were really insightful, even if we had some trouble understanding what was asked at first. So now we only have a few moments left. So I actually wanted to give you the opportunity, if you're up for it, now that you know each other's positions a bit more, to actually pose each other a question. It shouldn't be too involved, like a short answer should be possible for the question, if you can come up with it. otherwise, I don't want to put you on the spot, so you can definitely say no.
Can I ask?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
When I discuss like about carbon pricing and carbon tax with people, especially here in Italy, I realize that it is very unpopular. And all people, the first reaction is, oh my God, another tax, no, please. So my question is, what can we do also at a communicative level to gain the social support for the carbon tax?
I think one important way is politically to try to combine a carbon tax maybe with tax reductions in other areas, or as Fausto, as you said, where some of the carbon dividends get paid back to the people. Otherwise, I agree with you. Otherwise, it has been a political problem in many countries, right? Like no one wants to pay additional money, right? But if you find ways, and the Austrian government passed a carbon tax last year, which is a very interesting approach. It's a coalition government between the Conservative Party and the Green Party. And so what they did is they passed the carbon tax, but they combined it with an income tax reform where they also reduced some of the other taxes, and some of the revenue will be rebated back to the population. And I think you need ways like that to convince more people and tell them, look, you will actually get something out of it. You might get a carbon dividend, and it's really kind of like for more carbon intensive ways and production methods. And I think it's a challenge. I agree with it. I think people in the US have stopped calling it a carbon tax. They call it a carbon fee in many areas. They call it a carbon dividend and fee model. That has been a bit better in terms of communication, I think, even though it's the same thing. But I think those are some of those things we can do. At the end of the day, it is a tax. But if we tell people we will reduce the taxes somewhere else, and maybe they get out revenue neutral and they don't have a negative impact, I think that's a way where we can make a powerful argument. I have a question for Samantha. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I have a quick reply to that. I suppose I'm sitting at a different end of the world system where we're not talking about implementing a carbon tax here, but we're talking about having carbon border taxes stopping our exports from into Europe. So if I'm looking at the sort of from a different angle. If to the extent that pushes change, then I think then it's good. I think what I'm trying to say is I think there's so many issues, there's so many interconnected issues that require addressing. It's like we need to do. It's almost like you feel like we have to do everything all at once. Now, in such a situation, you can feel overwhelmed, and you can't. What are the first few steps that you have to take? But we have to address the employment crisis. We have to address the inequality crisis. We have to address the poverty crisis. We have to address the climate crisis. And the question of employment in linking those things together seems to me the most central issue, the most central pressing issue.
Thank you. I think Sanjay had a question for Samantha.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, I mean, especially being in South Africa, and as you said, I think, as you correctly pointed out, most of the carbon pricing in many cases is in the developed world. So what do you think are the most concrete measures that governments such as those of South Africa and other developing countries can take to prepare for climate, both on the mitigation side, but also on the adaptation side? I mean, budgets are constrained, right? And as you correctly pointed out, we have a big lack of finance. So are there concrete measures that you would like to see that can go a long way in preparing the South African economy more for the coming transition and also for the impacts of climate, which I believe are already being felt there?
Yeah. I think that, firstly, that the energy system needs to be really overhauled. And there's a particular province on Mpumalanga, and Mpumalanga is dominated by coal mines. It has 13 currently active coal-fired power stations. There's a Sasol, which makes liquid fuel from coal, is a major South African company. It's also based in Mpumalanga. It's vertically integrated. It owns coal mines. So there's a particular urgent issues around what's going to come to the workforce in Mpumalanga, who, as quite rightly, coal has to go, what is going to become of them? Then where will they be absorbed? And you know, in the sort of nightmare scenario, there will be a huge increase in interprovincial migration. Now, there's already a lot of xenophobia, attacks on migrants, you know, violence. You know, that's a very kind of unpleasant part of the contemporary politics. The nightmare scenario, of course, is that if there aren't short-term, in the next 5, 10 years, 15 years at the outset, measures to address changing in Mpumalanga, then we have a very large social problem. So social problems will increase, not diminish. So energy, transition from Mpumalanga, increasing the funding to ramp up our capacity to manufacture solar and energy seems to me to be really their priorities. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, super helpful.
Well, thank you very much. I'm wondering if there's any other question for Fausto, maybe. Otherwise, we will wrap it up. Okay. Well, thank you so much for this super interesting panel discussion, and also thank you to our audience for all the questions. I'm happy that we were able to integrate some of them into the discussion, and that Manuel was also able to speak himself and ask his question. And we definitely want to say sorry that we couldn't answer all questions in the given time. It appears that it was a really well, engaging topic for all of you, and thank you so much for all the questions that you asked. Yes, so yeah, again, I want to thank you, panelists, for being here tonight and talking to us about all of this. And then I wanted to remind you that the Summer Academy is going on. And we have another evening lecture tomorrow, which is about the Sustainable Development Goals, and also, quite interestingly, about the contradictions that might exist between the different SDGs and how we can address that together. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of you again here tomorrow at the same time, 7 p.m. For this lecture. Yes, thank you again so much for being here.